My name is Robert Livingston, and this is a short video to demonstrate how a KM grid palette is created. Consider a hypothetical app or conglomeration of apps that invite control by Keyboard Maestro macros. Imagine that it is an audio tool and the user needs to control the sound level and the frequency. Whether because it's a single app that has this functionality buried in submenus, or because it's actually a group of apps and devices that need to work in harmony, Keyboard Maestro seems like a good way to control the setup. So the user sketches out the basic controls that are needed, and it's decided that 8 buttons arranged in 2 rows of 4 should provide an adequate interface. Now that this artificial situation has been created, let's see how KM grid palettes could be used to implement it. The first thing we need to do is to create a new palette. So we'll go to the Configure menu and select this option and create a new palette. We'll give it a sensible name like Audio Controller. You will then be presented with a generic raw palette. We need to customize this palette to fit our needs. So we'll go to the Configure menu and select Grid Construct to make our particular palette. The user does not need the full 10 by 10 grid, and the first step is to make the small palette with only 2 rows and 4 columns. Then give our palette window title some name like Audio Dashboard. With this basic task complete, we can now customize the individual buttons to match and describe their function. Click on a button in the selection grid and set up its properties. Generally, you would decide whether to assign a keyboard shortcut to the button and whether to make that shortcut visible on the final palette button. For this example, we'll assign shortcuts to all the buttons, but make only those of the second row visible. For the first row, we will just use the keyboard consecutive keys Q, W, E, and R. The other important property is the tip, which is just a text description of the button's functionality, which becomes visible when the cursor passes over the button. This reinforces the purpose of the button if the graphic that will be associated with it is not completely clear. In general, it makes sense for all the buttons to get a tip. We can bring up a reminder of what we sketched out as the purpose of the buttons in the first row and the second row. For this first frequency button, as a demonstration, I'll provide more extensive information. You will notice that this button is shown in a light orange color, which indicates that it has information associated with it. The other buttons that we have processed are seen as a light purple color, implying that there is a tip associated with them. And now the final button will associate X as the shortcut to associate that with maximum, and we're going to make it visible on the button. And at this point, we are done with the construction of the palette. And now you can see that the basic palette is complete. The tips show up when the cursor sits over the button, period. The lower row has its keyboard shortcuts visible. We can option click on this button to see the basic information that we entered relating to that button. We now have to deal with designing the graphics that are going to be associated with the buttons. You can use any graphics engine that you prefer to create the buttons. Here we have the 8 that we need. Each button is 64 by 64 pixels. We have placed a 1 pixel line of gray here, which is useful to visually separate the button margins on the final palette. And we can give these buttons a sensible name here, but prepend a 2-digit number that matches the name of the button to which they're going to be attached. This is key to make the link work. We now go to the Configure menu again and choose Button Pictures, and we will now get an interface to associate the buttons one by one with their picture. Now we have selected all the pictures that we need. We have this list of the 8 buttons, and they have the digits at the front of their names that associate them with the button locations on the palette. So we're done with that task, and now we can see our final palette. The design is complete. The manual would explain how clicking on the buttons is associated with the Keyboard Maestro macros. Thank you for your attention. Any comments or questions are welcomed, and send them to my email address.